60 seconds about who they are and what they are interested in terms of disruptive new business models, and then we'll get into some discussion between us. Giles, as you kindly pour everybody a glass of water, maybe I can start with you. Thank you.
Have a sip first.
That's allowed.
Good evening. I'm Giles Andrews. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of Zopa. Zopa was the world's first peer-to-peer lending business back in 2005 when we launched. Feels like quite a long time ago now. So a very innovative business in a pretty uninnovative sector in financial services. Peer-to-peer means very different things to different people, and I think a lot of people focus on the sort of social and collaborative side of the peer-to-peer model, and I think that's of enormous value to consumers. It's very helpful to us in terms of trying to build a brand and build awareness. But actually, I think when we're talking about disruption, I focus rather more on the efficiency side of the business model. And I think the really powerful thing about the peer-to-peer model is it's extraordinarily efficient. And to me, that's the power of disruption.
Giles, thank you.
Justin D. Kosmowski, now at Puma, and a recovering consultant. And I think some of the discussion today, I have been working within Puma on how do we embed sustainability in our business, both from an innovation standpoint on the end of the pipeline, if you like, in terms of product, but also in terms of supply chain, and how can we shift there to ensure that the environmental and social impact is improved. Before that, also working in emerging markets, and there, the business model opportunities is one of the things I wanted to raise here, and certainly can talk about later on, are the emerging markets also an area where we have perhaps more opportunity because the incumbents, from a consumer standpoint, there's less of that kind of momentum behind the same model. So it's something I'm also interested in.
My name's Cressy. I'm the co-founder, director of Elvis & Cressy. We reclaim wastes, make cool products, and then give half the profits to charities. Are we disruptive? I suppose that's too negative a term for me, but in the sense that I'm not a designer or a waste manager, maybe that's a bit disruptive. Essentially, I think we are part of the opportunity landscape because we're here to share, we're here to be very transparent. Essentially, I'm here with a shovel and sort of ready to start digging.
Okay, so I'm Paul Turner. I work for the Lloyds Banking Group, and I'm responsible for the community and sustainable business activities there. Banking, as we all know, has been through quite a lot of challenges in the last few years, and there's nothing like a burning platform, I think, to get the business to look hard at what it's there for. And I think that there are three areas, Mike, that really interest me in this debate. One is purpose, the second is around collaboration, and the third is on innovation. And for purpose, that if the crisis really got us as an organisation to look at why do we exist, and that caused us to look at our purpose, and from our purpose came the measurements through which we will determine whether we're succeeding. And those measurements, interestingly, are economic, they're social, and they're environmental. So we are looking at purpose through the lens of a triple bottom line. We've entered into new collaborations as well with social enterprise as we experiment and learn that market, and that's brought innovation into our business as well as it's helped the social entrepreneurs that we're supporting. And on the point of innovation, we recognise digital to be an area that will potentially really transform the landscape for us. But when I look at innovation in other sectors as well, that will affect our business as new currencies potentially come into play as well.
Thank you, Paul. Sally.
Hi, I'm Sally Uren, Forum for the Future. I'm here because I spend a lot of my time looking out to the future and understanding that we are headed to a very different future, and that if we are going to deliver a sustainable future, then actually mainstreaming some of these new business models that we have examples of here today are going to be really important. And I've got lots of handy tips as to how that might happen.
Thank you. So let's get the ball rolling. What could be quite a theoretical discussion, but I want to start quite practical. I mean, Giles, Zopa's emerged. It's starting to become a disruptive threat to the established financial system. Just give us a perspective about where you've got to and why people are responding well to you. But perhaps most important, how are you going to take this model to scale?
So in terms of scale, we've lent about £400 million. We're lending about 20 million a month, which gives us about just over 1% market share of the personal loan space. So beginning to be interesting, I wouldn't call that scale. Interestingly, financial services businesses, I think, become easier to run with some sort of scale, so some sort of momentum breed scale. The challenge is always how to manage growth. And I think the reason we've been able to grow as fast as we have is because we focus so thoroughly on the value to the consumer in a sector that has sometimes lost sight of that, even if it's beginning to wake up to it again now.
And very clearly, you're emerging because there's a bit of a trust deficit in the established financial system. But why will people trust this new emerging upstart that no one's ever heard of previously with their money? Why are people buying into your model?
I think the trust deficit is important, but it's by no means sufficient. So I think people buy into the model because it offers better value. I think if we didn't offer better value, then being more trusted is rather meaningless. And becoming more trusted for something that's unheard of is challenging in and of itself. So one of the biggest problems we had when we started was, I suppose, ask the audience, kind of radical thought, lend some money to a stranger on the internet and expect to get it back. Sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? So we had to focus very, very hard on the limited trust assets we could build that were realistic and live to them. So we focused, unsurprisingly, on transparency. If you're completely transparent in everything you do, and you have to be transparent all the time, you can't wake up one morning and say it's a bit inconvenient today, so you have to live it consistently. And just inch by inch, building up trust assets. We were then obviously dealt quite a good hand by what happened in 2007, 2008, in terms of the trust deficit of the alternatives. But I don't think that's sufficient in and of itself to explain our growth.
I mean, Paul, I mean, we're not turning this into an incumbent versus upstart in the financial system, but just give me your perspective of trust. You've seen from within the established incumbent system the problems we've got. How are you responding to that, and how are you meeting the threat of the Kivas, the Kickstarters, the Zopas emerging?
Yes, I think one of the issues around trust, and you're absolutely right to flag, I mean, it was a massive issue, is the sector became very complex, far too complex, I think, for the customer, and we need to put the customer absolutely at the heart of this to really understand. So it's interesting to be on the journey in my organisation to see how they've responded to that. So they've simplified the business massively, a focus on the UK, and putting our customers absolutely at the heart of that. And with that came a purpose, which is to help the UK prosper, to help Britain prosper. And when you look at your business through that lens, it determines what you do and what you don't do. And we've stopped doing quite a lot of stuff, and we've started doing more stuff. So I think we simplified the business model, Mike, and we focused the business model, and we put the customer absolutely at the heart of that business model.
Now, I know you get that, Paul. How are you helping tens of thousands of colleagues who need to deliver now and turn the organisation around now? How are you getting them to think outside the immediacy of challenge today to prepare for this different future?
We've got a compelling vision for the organisation, which we share with our colleagues. The mission of helping Britain prosper, we're really driving that into the business culture and challenging our colleagues to say when they don't think we're doing that. So there's a really interesting dialogue with colleagues where we launched our new codes of business and personal responsibility, and we separated the two out. So we've got a code of business responsibility, which is what our stakeholders should expect of us. But the code of personal responsibility is all about what colleagues should expect of each other and expect of us as well. And that code really encourages challenge.
Now, Giles, I mean, Paul's got this challenge of changing this huge organisation. You're a relatively small when you get your arms round your colleagues in the office, literally and personally at this stage. Do you fear becoming big? Will you lose your transparent values as you become as big as the Lloyds maybe one day?
Well, I think it's something you've got to be very aware of. But I think at the heart of what we do is, and I hope this does remain, is what we offer is incredibly simple. So it's a very simple mission, if you like, for people to get behind, offering great value in personal loans and savings rates by connecting people directly is a pretty simple idea that I hope would remain easy to communicate and
I want to hold a thought there for all of us, and that's simplicity, because I think I, as a large business, would recognise what Paul said about the world has become too complex. It's become too complex for the consumer. It's too complex for us to run. So this breath of fresh air about simplicity and hanging on to that principle into the future will be very important. Now, we've talked about intangibles. Money is about an intangible asset. Let's turn to the material world now. Cressy, I mean, again, you've started this inspirational new model, this exciting new model that's widely talked about now. How are you going to take it to scale?
Scale for us is all about turnover, but not necessarily turnover of money. It's about turnover of waste. And this is the figure at the end of every year that we're most proud of if it's grown significantly. And what has happened over the last 3 or 4 months is that large companies are coming to us with their waste problems, the things that they can't fix. And that is going to drive massive scale through our business because we are solution providers at the end of the day. So I think that, yeah, our brand is provocative and it's great and it's wonderful to have because you can smash people over the head with it. But in terms of actually getting the job done, we're going to scale through collaboration.
And Justin, again, I mean, to this challenge that Paul has got, established business, many colleagues, many existing product lines competing hard on a global basis. How are you starting to engage people and ask them to lift their heads and imagine a different way of dealing with the sneaker?
Puma, to some degree, you mentioned burning platform. We are also going through a massive transformation of our business. So reorganizing on business unit lines and shifting a lot of what we're doing and how we're doing it. So for me internally, as someone who's trying to drive a change, it's a fantastic environment because so much is changing already that we are sort of tearing this down and rebuilding it, and therefore I am scrambling around trying to rebuild it with sustainability embedded there. So there's a lot of opportunity in that respect because we have a very ready and willing audience to some degree internally to do that. It is a massively complex business. We have thousands of suppliers in multiple tiers and multiple countries and delivering multiple products because we are making shoes, apparel, and accessories. And we have licensed partners. I mean, the complexity is really massive. And I think that what we're trying to do is simply focus on the very few things that we have learned and are learning would make the most difference. So we quite famously did an environmental profit and loss in 2011. And what we're able to look at now is say, okay, well, we know where the biggest impact is. So how do we focus on that? And for 57% of our impact, 2010 impact is on tier 4, so raw materials, and the vast majority of that is leather and cotton. So when we start looking at, okay, well, how do we start recycling leather and cotton? So we're not using new virgin material, but we start to close that loop, and or look at alternative materials that perform as well, that consumers like as much, and that's the challenge. I mean, there's a reason that I bet most of us are wearing leather shoes. They are great. So, we need to come up with better alternatives. We have a few examples of ways that we're looking at doing that. But I think people get internally, so, we rebuild, we focus a more consumer-focused organization, and then introducing some of those key inflection points and key information on where can we really focus. And I think that's what, focus was mentioned before, I think, from Paul here. It's absolutely critical because otherwise these issues and the opportunity set of business model innovation is just too huge for perhaps anyone to really get their arms around. So being able to focus with good information for us has been very, very empowering.
Now, just like any big retail brand, you've spent 30 or 40 years perfecting supply chain management to be siloed, to be simple, to operate as quickly as it can, to be linear. How do you start to turn this big beastie into something very different? You've got literally hundreds of business models supplying you, some of which are very dependent on Puma, but not all. So how do you start to get the supply chain to think differently? How do you send the correct signals to say it's an investment worth making?
I think certainly, transparency helps. So we were very public with the EP&L results. We very quickly pointed to this big 57% of that impact, and I think that message was loud and clear, and not always positively. So the leather industry didn't love it, but I think that it was important to get out there and publicly say, like, hey, here's the reality of our business, the best we can estimate it now, and we have another EP&L coming out soon that will give us even more detail. So putting that information out there in our case, and then we are lucky in the industry that we have bodies like the Sustainable Apparel Coalition that do bring the key players of our industry, both suppliers, non-branded suppliers, as well as the key brands, together to work on some of these issues. So things like the SAC's Higg Index, which is a way of measuring the sustainability of players in the industry, and not just looking at products, but brand and others, are driving that thinking and are bringing everyone to some degree in a similar direction at least. And we'll all apply it and work against the Higg Index, if you like, in different ways, but that does help to kind of unify and bring everyone in one direction. Because in the end of the day, the supply chain does get shared. You know, we are working with similar suppliers, especially when you look at the raw material phase. So those kind of signals to the other industries that serve us, if you like, that are part of that supply chain, have been very important. But we are not. There's a lot of change to be done still, and I think it's a matter of consistent messaging, and the momentum is absolutely growing, for sure. But I think quote unquote upstarts, if you like, you know, those challengers will be key to showing what's possible. Will be key to driving, you know, and accelerating that change within the bigger bulk of industries like ours.
Now, Cressy, I mean, we've got here a business model similar to ours, which is very much locked into hundreds of different participants in the supply chain. Can you ever see yourself having that formalized business structure, or are you always going to be an outsourcing agency, making the connections between somebody who's got a waste, somebody else that needs it over there? Will you always be that facilitator, or are you increasingly going to create supply chains similar to us?
I think we will. I mean, you outsource more than I do, what I've been learning since I got here tonight. So I think we will be a facilitator in the short term, but we also like the idea of building manufacturing capacity ourselves. We've started an apprenticeship program, obviously much smaller than Mulberry's, but very much in the same pattern that they're doing right now. And we would like to see manufacturing come closer to home, or manufacturing be shared amongst our buyers. So one of the things that we're going to be starting in the next 3 or 4 months is that customers could come into our factory and make their own products. We'll see how that goes. It could be some broken equipment. But I think that we don't know. Every day is an adventure, so I'm not sure I would ever say this is exactly how we're going to face the future. Elvis and I tend to have a good time, and if it's not fun, we'll stop doing it, and that maybe that sense of fun is what brings new customers to us.
I mean, just a point about manufacturing, I can see why you might be wanting to do it yourself. Is it driven by a social desire to reshore manufacturing to the UK, or is there a commercial benefit from you controlling how the raw material, the waste that you collect, is used?
There's one reason I like being in control of it is that I know how much people are paid, and I know they're paid well. And I know that nothing is going wrong in the sort of, you know, in the fashion world, like in the Bangladesh sense. We don't have any of those problems in our supply chain. We can also do really cool things in the manufacturing world. We started manufacturing in a prison in the UK, and we've set up a prison workshop. And that's designed to, I think prisoners are 60% less likely to reoffend if they're actively employed while in prison. And that's just fun we can have. Why not do that? That's available to all of us. By the way, there's workshops empty in prisons all across the country, so everyone should be doing it. So it's fun to do these things and to be engaged with these things, and I like to be involved in every aspect of the business. I think I would struggle to be in charge of a business Puma size because I would lose that personal connection. I still clean fire hose, and I think it would be very difficult to stop doing that.
Because, again, we'll come back to it a little later. A very profound thought, maybe many years from here, but I sometimes wonder, can you ever be a big business in a sustainable future? Literally, do you need to be like Cressy, controlling and seeing everything within the sphere of your influence, but eventually you get to a point where you can't, and you need to allow somebody else to grow into that space? Philosophical and not to dwell on too much, but Sally, you've sat and heard about 2 different sectors. Give some observations about what you've heard and maybe some examples from other sectors that have started to think about this space.
Well, I could do that, or
Disruptive.
So I mean, I think there are lots of examples in lots of other sectors, and there are many sectors where you could have a sort of smaller, newer business model compared to the more traditional model that most people would recognise. But in thinking about tonight and thinking about why it's so important to discuss these business models, it struck me that actually there are sort of 2 things that perhaps we haven't quite got right yet and we need to take quite seriously. And the first reflection that I had sort of reading through what was going to happen tonight is that, as you started off by saying, Mike, the science, so the IPCC report, all the data we see tells us that we're headed for quite difficult, choppy waters. So we're heading for quite a different future. And I discovered a great term that I'm boring everyone with at the moment, which is VUCA. We're headed for a VUCA world, a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world. And if you don't believe that, just look at the IPCC report, because that's where we're headed. So we're headed for this VUCA world, whether we like it or not. And we kind of know that, but yet these newer business models that have the potential to be really sustainable, why aren't they scaling? Why are they still quite isolated? Why have they not mainstreamed? So my first real reflection is that we need to understand one of the key barriers that I think are there, which is stopping these more innovative business models, not all of them, but quite a few of them scaling. And that's actually, we forget how change happens. And so I was really struck by this at the British Retail Consortium dinner 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I was a guest of a very well-known retailer, I won't say who it was, but I was sitting there and it was really interesting because I was going, hooray, the economy's showing signs of picking up, hooray, we can go back to where we were. And you just showed us a chart that shows the sector most likely to be disrupted is retail. And it was like watching lots of hamsters going around like this, thinking, it's brilliant, we can go back to where we were. And I suddenly thought, actually, this sector is not going to embrace these new business models right now because they have not experienced the need for change. And we have a change curve that we use a lot at Forum for the Future, and step one is experiencing the need for change. And until, as individuals, we've experienced the need for change, and individuals in organisations, as end consumers, in whatever capacity we are, then things won't change. You've all been into meetings, I am sure, with a new brilliant idea, and you're trying to convince your boss and you're just getting kind of dead eyes. And it's because maybe that experience of need for change isn't there, and that's why to experience that need for change, you need to look to the future, you need to do seeing is believing, but quite critically, you need to have an emotional connection, a story. And Jim sent us around some homework ahead of tonight, and that was the recent interview by Joe Confino and will.i.am. It's brilliant, you've got to read it. But what will.i.am says really powerfully is it's about the people, and we forget that. So my first reflection is one of the big barriers that we have, and equally what could be an enabler to really scaling up some of these new, more innovative business models, is actually understanding how change happens and for us all to experience the need for change. My second reflection is that I think that if we are really going to see these new business models, and you talk about them in your blog, Mike, if we're going to see them deliver a sustainable future, then we need a sustainability framework. Now, I would say that, wouldn't I? Because that's all I talk about a lot of the time. But I say that because I want to show you my visual aid people. It's a blue rabbit. But it's not just any old blue rabbit. It's popped out of a 3D printer. Now, my kids will probably love this. To me, it's plastic tat. And so 3D printers offer huge opportunities for sustainability. And again, there's a blog on the GM site really showing how 3D printers could really deal with some issues around distributed manufacturing, really help us deal with some of the issues that we face. But without a sustainability framework, understanding, well, what are the impacts of using these printers, we could just end up with a gazillion plastic rabbits. And so we need a sustainability framework to understand how we can take these new business models to scale. And another example would be, we're all talking about closed loop, it's very important, and so we're seeing lots more anaerobic digestion, particularly in the food retail sector. Now, some of that food waste that's headed towards anaerobic digesters hitherto was going to feed the homeless. So what's the best scaling up of that model from a sustainability perspective? So 2 reflections, which didn't really answer your question, but I had to say them, was we need to really understand how change happens and be very clear that the first step is experiencing the need for change and understand how we do that. And that's where brands are really powerful, telling that story. And when we're looking at the potential for these new business models to deliver sustainable development outcomes, to deliver a sustainable future, let's have a sustainability framework, because otherwise we could overrun by these things.
Scary thought. Now, I'm going to come back to technologies, the good and the bad of them in terms of sustainable business models. But before I do that, let's just turn to the consumer. Because fundamentally, I believe that one of the barriers we've got to a sustainable future at the moment is the consumer's not pulling or pressing for it. So businesses are going through the motions at the moment of sort of doing it because it sort of makes sense. But there's no hunger there because people are uncertain about the consumer's appetite for new models. Giles, again, you've put the consumer at the heart of a better business model. You've already told us about simplicity. You've already told us about a better deal for the consumer. Just to expand upon that.
I'm not sure consumers have huge appetite for change for the sake of change or for new business models because they wake up one morning and think, I want a new business model. They simply want better value. And until a business can demonstrate that it offers better value, then the method of delivery, I think, is rather meaningless.
Yeah. Provocative. So, just again, I mean, let's just play a little bit of tennis on this one. So the consumers at the moment just want better value.
But, no, not just better value, but I think better value is very, very high on the list of their hierarchy of needs.
And how much can you smuggle in behind those words, better value, in terms of social environmental improvement? So the consumer gets a better deal. How can I be clear as a stakeholder staring into your world that that's actually just not a better deal commercially, it's a better deal for society and the planet as well?
So I think better value has all sorts of different dimensions. So if you take the motivation for people who use our platform as an example, some of our lenders are really interested in the financial return and actually don't really care too much about other things. Some of our other lenders care predominantly about the social return and the fact that they're helping people and giving better value to other people. The reality is most people are somewhere between the two. And I don't think it's for us as a business to judge where they should be on that continuum. So it's our job, if you like, to provide a range of different values which will resonate with them according to their own particular predilection, and for us to be transparent about how that value is offered. So if we're offering social value, then let's be clear what the money's being used for, who it's going to. If they want a financial return, let's be very clear about how that financial return makes sense.
Now, Justin, you've started to do this to agree with EPL, which has played very well for this audience, for the brilliant brains of sustainability. What does it mean for your consumer, if not today, possibly in the future? When I buy into the Puma business model, how are you going to tell me about I'm getting a great shoe, great value, but also something a little bit wider?
We'll continue on the sort of provocative. I would say absolutely zero. I don't think EP&L is a tool for us, is helpful to talk to industry partners, to talk to, as you said, the brilliant minds of sustainability, but it's way too complex to bring to a 16 to 25-year-old who's walking through a big sports retailer and has tons of brands, private label, all at an option. I think that is a level of complexity that if we try to bring that to the marketplace, we're in deep trouble. What I think when you were speaking of value, one of the things that resonate for me is as a brand, why does someone buy Puma versus something else? There are the soft aspects of identity and identifying with a brand, and Usain Bolt is my hero, therefore I want to wear Puma because he wears Puma, or I know Puma is a more sustainable brand, and I may not know the details of the EP&L figures and where 57% and what the savings were, but I feel better about it. And I think for us, one of the things that we're trying to translate is how do we have the technical and rigor behind our efforts, but then bring those into the marketplace in a way that is absolutely engaging for a 16 to 25-year-old consumer who is getting tons of messaging all over the place, and it's got to get embedded into the design and into what the brand is and what the product says intrinsically.
I mean, good answer on product information, but when you start to ask consumers to participate in a different consumption model, so I buy, I rent, I hire my shoes in the future from Puma, I return to the shop with them when I finish with them, how are consumers going to buy into that?
To be determined. I think they're one of the things that we're looking at that model very seriously. So we have an entire effort around closing the loop and understanding how we can start to put that into play. And we've done a cradle-to-cradle certified collection, and so there's some points that we've looked at where we've really driven innovation to a high degree, and we've had a ton of learning come back. And one of those is that, for the most part, now the vast majority, by the end of this year, it should be 100% of our stores have bins where you can bring clothing back, unlike like many others. And yet we have very low volumes coming through there, to be honest. So the consumer is not yet going shopping with a full shopping bag of things to bring back to then fill and take back. So I think we're looking at membership models. We're looking at actually kind of the history of our industry to some degree, and that's one of the things I think is interesting about this debate is, are we just going back to the old ways of doing business that actually worked for millennia, or at least centuries before all this new innovation happened, and we actually got further away from where we should be? And the sports business, before there were sports retailers, started with sports clubs. So each town had an athletic club, and people would go there and play football or run around a track or do whatever it is they wanted to do from a sports standpoint. And that's where they got their kit. They used it to do the sports, then they left it there, and they went home with whatever it is they were wearing before. And that still exists to some degree. So can we go back to those types of models and learn from the history of our industry and where it started when things were shared and you didn't have this sort of take, make, waste kind of model in action, and learn from that and start to engage that. So, there is a huge amount of identity around some of the major sports assets. As of next season, Arsenal will be one of our assets, and we're really looking forward to working with them on some of these issues, because that's where you do have consumers identifying with and really passionately engaged with a brand, and we think that there are opportunities within that space to start to put some of these more closed loop models that do require different action by the consumer, which right now is challenging, and we're not really seeing it happen in our industry, at least to a high degree.
I mean, what if you put an economic value for the consumer on the return? So you've got a bright Cressy here ready to use all the shoes that come back to turn them into something else. Your waste problem is her solution. How are you going to wrestle them out of the consumer's hand? Would you give them €1 per pair of shoes one day for bringing it back?
Could be, or it could be that part of the way you get a new shoe is to bring your old shoe back, i.e., we're no longer actually selling you the shoe, we're just giving you this, sort of the use versus ownership. Yeah, so it may be that we don't have to wrestle it from them. It's just part of what they've engaged with Puma is, and this is very far in the future, is as a member of the brand, and part of what they get then is new shoes every year, new T-shirts, new whatever that is, and therefore it's not a matter of wrestling it from them. It's simply part of what they do to continue to have the new, the better, the et cetera, which we all want as human beings, I think. You bring back the old to get the new, and it's so whether it's outsourced to another brand to then take that waste and do something with it, as we have right now with ICO, who's our key partner on that take-back program, or we have in that future, innovated the means and the technologies with which we take it back, and it's a source for us of new raw material, so that we get away from what I predict, and the VUCA world would also indicate, will be more volatile cotton prices, more difficulty finding good leather, et cetera. We need to probably start capturing our own waste as valuable inputs to our machine. And I think when you start having that, then localization might happen, because you'll want to be close to where that happens. And do you need to ship it somewhere else to then ship it back? Probably is going to stop making sense. So I think what we're looking at in the very long term is everything that has been made in externality is going to be getting internalized. And how does that change the game? And that comes down to input costs. It comes down to labor, and where do you have the best labor? I mean, there's a great article in the New York Times recently on the Wisconsin textile industry having a rejuvenation, but these companies not being able to find skilled labor to actually work in these factories that have contracts with brands who want to have a Made in the USA label on them. So I think those those shifts are happening, and what we're trying to look at is how do we start innovating now, and we've got some things in the pipeline that are really exciting in terms of creating that loop and engaging the consumer as a brand. You've got to tap into that identity component. You've got to make it a something that the consumer really wants to do. I don't think €1 per pair, or sort of wagging your finger at them, which is to some degree been our approach so far with our take-back program. Those aren't going to work. I don't think it's got to become part of what they want to do, because it's embedded in the identity of the brand and themselves and all that.
I mean, Chris, again, I'd appreciate your perspective on the consumer. But before we do that, you're increasingly stepping into big companies and helping them look at waste through a new lens. How can you help a company turn around their business model and say, don't worry about that, I can actually use it here, I can make those connections?
Well, how we do that is a lot of companies, I would imagine that they can do all of these things themselves, but they're really, really big ships, and it takes them a long time to turn around. And sometimes you need somebody who's just really obnoxious to come in and say, why don't we try something else? And someone who won't take no for an answer and is really, really stubborn. I think sometimes you need an outside voice to achieve these objectives, because then if it fails, you have someone external to blame it on as well. That's probably quite helpful. But our consumer, I think it's interesting that we sometimes think the consumer, like better value is great, is a great way of saying it, because I think consumers are really actually quite sophisticated. And the reason why our company grew through the recession is that people were still spending money. They were just spending it really carefully. So they wanted to buy a very thoughtful product. And it's really obvious to see in food. I mean, we've got all these cooking shows. These chefs are rock stars now. And it's because people can talk about food until the cows come home. But people also talk about luxury goods in that same way. And our product tends to have a better story. So if you put me between Paul Smith and Mulberry, well, yes, Mulberry, good quality, very well made. It's a brown leather wallet. Paul Smith, good quality, very well made. It has a mini on it. But then my product, we donate 50% of the profits to firemen. Firemen are sexy. It's a 25-year-old product. It's fireproof. It's waterproof. The lining is decommissioned parachute silk, and we give money to the British Forces Foundation. And you could talk about it like food until the cows come home. So I think sometimes you need to go into a bigger business and present them with these exciting stories about their own materials. You know, we're doing, I sat on a panel with Veolia the other day, and I don't think anyone really could believe how excited I was about the flake coming out of their Raynham facility. I had to sort of steal bags of it to take home with me, and I've got it dotted around the house, and we're trying to imagine how we could redo a kitchen with this stuff, or make lights. And their idea is, oh, we can sell this for £500 a tonne if it's clean. And I'm thinking I could sell it for £50,000 a tonne if I divide it into some really sexy, amazing products. So you have to, the vocabulary you have to use is different. It shouldn't be, oh, this is a green product. It should be, this is a beautiful, exciting, sexy, amazing product, and of course you want it, because it's awesome.
Giles, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but your basic model is connecting the person making the loan with the lendee. You're bringing a human connection that we've probably lost from the global financial system over the last 20, 30 years. Paul, how are you starting to reintroduce that consumer connection with the proverbial bank manager who knew everybody in their town 40, 50 years ago and could make a loan based upon their knowledge of the town? How are you reintroducing that personalisation?
I think first of it, Mike, is the piece around focus. So we're focusing on the UK. So we're focusing on a market that's here on our doorstep. We've got the biggest network of branches, and we're certainly empowering the branch manager now to make more decisions. And also we're encouraging them through our programs to reconnect with the community, be that through their support for social entrepreneurs, be that through the charities our foundations support. There are a myriad of ways that they are now reconnecting with the community. And we're also looking at our assets. So we're on many high streets. Those assets actually could be used for more than just a branch of a bank. And we're exploring how we may be able to open them for other uses as well. So simple answer is multitude of different ways.
Now, on behalf of Justin, I think we owe an apology to a couple of Spurs fans in the room who are deeply grieved that Puma are getting to bed with Arsenal. But forgive us, it was but an example. Sally, I just want to turn to you now. I mean, give us some examples from some other sectors that have started to understand a different relationship with the consumer. I think BMW in particular doing some very interesting ways of engaging the consumer in a different way of understanding mobility. Who are the other examples out there, putting the consumer first in a sustainable world?
Well, what springs to mind is an example from, well, it's retail, but it's do-it-yourself retail. Does that count as a sort of slightly different sector? So I love what B&Q is doing through Street Club. So B&Q, best known for its big orange brand and its big stores where you can buy anything you really want to buy, really, having been very recently. And obviously they've got their strategy around being net positive, which is a Kingfisher PLC strategy. And you all know the statistic that on average a powder will get used for about 2 seconds in its life, and it sits and collects dust and so on and so forth. And so what B&Q have done is bought this digital platform called Street Club, where you can basically go online and share power tools, and you can share anything really. And the pathway to value creation is really unclear, and that's what I love about it. So is this making B&Q any money right now? No. Would it in the future? I think it probably could. But it's a very different business model, and it's predicated on localism, it's predicated on sharing, and the things actually that for individuals do create value. And I think what you were saying earlier, Giles, is really interesting in that our notion of value is changing the whole time. And for me, I think what I see through the work that we do with many different organisations and brands, and through the work we do where we create scenarios looking at future consumers, then this notion of purpose, which is, Paul, your comment, is actually starting to really determine our notion of value, and the two are becoming closer. And I think that the organisations that are doing well right now are beginning to ask, well, what am I here to do? And for B&Q, I'm here to help people make their homes better. So how can I do that in a way that works from a sustainability perspective? It's actually by leasing my tools rather than selling them. And I think the BMW story is really interesting because that's the whole mobility story. And what they're basically saying to their customers, how can we help you move? And so the best examples I see are where actually you've moved from talking about what can I give you to what service can I provide. So if you're a drinks company, it's about hydration. If you're a food company, it's about nutrition. If you're a car company, it's about it's about mobility. And when you start to think about what is it that I'm here to do, what is the service I'm here to provide, you start to get a lot more imaginative ideas about how you can take that service to the end consumer.
Now, I'm going to move to you, the audience, in a moment, so start thinking of your questions. But before I do that, each of the panelists, very, very briefly, just give me a view on one sector that is ripe for disruption and why. Giles. And it doesn't have to be finance. If you...
Come back to me.
Okay.
I think it was interesting seeing the results where the crowd was pointing to retail. I think that might be one of the more difficult ones to disrupt, actually, because it is a part of sort of daily and weekly. It's what we do on a daily basis, right? You pop by the store, you pick up your paper. So I think actually retail might be one of the slower ones to shift. I think we're going to see it. More radical shifts more quickly, I would predict, in the more business-to-business arena. Transportation and air transport, et cetera, might be one area that gets shifted very quickly. I think we are certainly looking at multimodal transport and how to reduce the impact of just getting our products from A to B. And I think that is going to very quickly shift how transportation occurs. Not necessarily consumer transportation, not sort of getting on an airplane for a holiday, but more the vast majority of transport, which is industrial B2B kind of transport. I think that's probably where you'll see things shift very, very quickly, because consumers are very difficult to get to change. And I'm, as a consumer myself, pretty stubborn in some of my ways. So I think it'll happen most quickly in B2B, I would imagine.
Thank you. Cressy.
For me, I think the most exciting one is the waste sector. And it's because for a really long time, the big players were absolute dinosaurs, and only some of them, only recently, are waking up. But you still have a real heavy reliance in a lot of places on landfill, and that's embarrassing. So we'll see what happens, but I think that's really ripe for disruption, and they own effectively the raw materials that we're all going to be so desperate for in the future. So there's a lot of potential power there too.
Sally.
I actually think retail is being disrupted right now. I think the shift to online and the fact that people are exchanging goods and services with no financial transaction is pretty disruptive. And I think media is also in the grips of quite a big disruption at the moment. Two other areas where I think, watch out, energy. As we shift to community energy generation, I think that's going to really disrupt this notion of big centralised energy provision. And you already see in countries like Germany, community energy is scaling up. And that's going to be really disruptive if you've got a load of fixed assets where actually your ability to move them quickly to meet the changing demands of your consumer base is really limited. And then I think actually agricultural production is about to get one hell of a disruption, not because of issues around so much climate change and so on. We know about that, but I think what is a really interesting trend at the moment, which I think only some food retailers are beginning to understand, is actually as Indonesia, Brazil, all of these economies grow, then what you're seeing is a massive rise in South-South trading. And you're seeing this notion of the empowered producer, not the producer that has to sort of say, when the retailer says how high you know, do you want me to jump? No, that's the wrong way around. What is it? Please jump how high? Yes, they don't do that, but basically this empowered producer can say, actually, I can get a better price over here. So I think we're going to see some disruption in agricultural production at a primary production level.
So I'm going to call out two, and both linked to digital. So one is transport. You can now find how you get from your home to a destination, but an integrated transport solution that will get you from your home to a destination and back again. I think the person who cracks that will make a lot of money. And from an environmental and social perspective, I think there's some really interesting builds. The second link to that is on office accommodation. We shift an awful lot of people to work in big offices. Actually, with the technology that we have now and the flexibility to work remotely, why are we doing that from both an environmental and a health and well-being perspective? So I think that we could see an interesting change in how offices are used.
Well, I'll give you a sector which I think needs some disruption. I'm not sure I've got an answer to it, but I think with the aging population that we have, and I'm sure many people in the room have got aged relatives who they're increasingly concerned about, I think something around decentralised local care of the increasingly elderly population needs disrupted.
Spring back on that one. Another really interesting model is the shared ownership model. So elderly people living with family members or younger members, and again that could change how the domestic housing market works as well.
And I think fantastic examples. I'll just chuck in, I think mobility is right for disruption at this moment. The other area I think is the collapsing or concentrating world of food, well-being and healthcare. I think those sectors will increasingly come together in light of the challenge of the future.